we must be sure that the impact is real, meaning actually that the emissions reductions and removals from the project activity, either reforestation, agroforestry, or forest conservation, for example, are additional to the scenario without project implementation. Why is that? Because other way, we will be financing an activity that will have taken place either way without the need of carbon finance. And therefore, we will be adding more emissions or tons of CO2 to the atmosphere instead of actually reducing it. On the other side about permanence, we must account emissions or removals for a long term. And in this sense, permanence means that carbon, once removed, cannot be or should not be at least emitted back into the atmosphere. Usually, permanence from a project developer perspective is linked to the risk of reversal of those emissions reduced or removed. For example, if we are talking about nature-based projects, risk to the carbon could be to the carbon storage could be forest fires, diseases, for example, illegal logging as well. So every carbon project that we develop must have a comprehensive risk mitigation in place, and especially because prevention should be part of the project activities. In that case, there is an event of reversal of the emissions already reduced or removed, for example. We can also, let's say, mitigate the carbon losses, taking carbon credits or emission reduced from a buffer pool.
It's completely critical for the longevity of nature restoration and conservation projects for them to have an economic viability for communities. And we can really only scale restoration and maintain conservation if there are economically viable options for communities around the world. There's a lot of ways to do this, and this goes back to Asger's point around incentivizing conservation. And we need to come up with more ways to do that, but there are government programs like Payment for Ecosystem Services, not as many as there need to be, and not always structured in the perfect ways, but those do exist. There are government subsidies for sustainable agriculture, or we could just stop subsidizing conventional agriculture in many cases. There are sustainable development grants. There are carbon payments that can be done well and that can be done more poorly. And then there's, demand for sustainable products more broadly, right? Demand for sustainable timber, demand for agricultural products that do take care of the land, that do take care of biodiversity. So there's all of these different ways that we can make restoration economically viable if we build that in to the way that we're thinking about compensation, essentially, for work that's happening.
The carbon market, as it's been designed, and I totally agree with Clara here, and that's also the FCC's point of view, that carbon is only a small part of it, but again, achieve emission reductions or additional removals in as short as time possible. So that will naturally generate a favorism for the projects with high carbon flux density. And that means that creating projects that do not change the flux significantly needs to be, it's more difficult to design those. And in particular, then the project category we've seen over the past 15 years developing out of REDD+, among other, for avoided emissions, avoided deforestation, where basically you try to price something that doesn't happen. Now, the problem is in that is, as I see it, again, this inherited focus on incremental change, because that's not true payment for ecosystem services. I mean, the whole service provided of that forest, whether it changes or not, has a value for society. So one of the ways I think, and I know these conversations are going on, one of the things we could change, in particular the EU system design to respect this, is to say that what we value, what we price, that's the full emission negatively, that's a cost, and the full removal, not the change from one euro to the other. Because in that way, we make a business case for protecting nature, not just carbon optimizing nature. And if we change that basically pretty fundamental metric, then we can also much easier govern and create incentives for climate neutrality and even climate positive